because I believe that is the center of God's plan, always has been, always will be. And when Messiah comes back, the king runs the kingdom center out of Jerusalem. And it's imperative for us to stay on top of this, particularly during this season that is confusing the world. The world is full of fear and panic. The kingdom of God is stable. And I appreciate, again, all of you who showed up here today. And I appreciate all of you who are online, because that's just often wisdom and being careful because of what's happening. I named this one Kingdom 3 because we're still running through the Bible. And you have to understand that in creation, at the time of creation, everything, it doesn't interpret well in English. Everything was tohu. Everything was chaos. And vohu is established. I forget the English. There's no good translation for that. And his desire has always been to fill this world with his kingdom. And go ahead and put up the first screen. We'll make sure it's going to work, if you will, Joan. Yeah, from Beth Messiah. That's this kingdom center. We're going to see if the slideshow will work. There's the world as, it's only talking about this world. There's a universe out there. But his desire, from our knowledge, is to fill the world. He started with a kingdom center, of course, in the garden, right? And go out, subdue the world, deal with the chaos, and bring the kingdom. And the second attempt was the ark after the flood. I think Michael pointed out. Was that you who said that just the second time, the last time the world was shut down was the ark, the flood? And I said, that's good insight. I give Michael credit for that. But we saw the call of Abraham and the choosing of Israel and the all-important kingdom center of Jerusalem. That should be the next slide, should be Jerusalem. That's not putting down the garden or the ark or the call of Abraham, but as I said, just understand, this is the first kingdom center established in a populated world. And so it's really key. And it's in a populated world. Everything will always draw from Jerusalem, past, present, and future. Just a reality. When the king comes back, where does he reign from? Jerusalem. That's a really important kingdom center. But then we move beyond that. Next kingdom center we looked at was Antioch. That should be the next slide. And see Antioch up there in the corner. And from Antioch, we moved across to the next kingdom center. So a lot of congregations planted along, but it was Ephesus, which is today Turkey. What was then in the biblical times, it was Asia Minor. And we saw from that kingdom center, there's all kind of congregations planted around it. So congregations are a part of God's plan, but everything draws from a kingdom center. And I think all of you pretty much grasp the concept, especially since God planted us here in this neighborhood. After we had learned the concept of a kingdom center, he says, okay, now it's time for you to start acting like one. And we weren't a kingdom center on Swift, nor were we a kingdom center on Fruitville. But here in this neighborhood, we are a kingdom center. And now most of you grasp what that is, and most of you see it. Until this virus shut down all the ministries, we were impacting this neighborhood in a great way. And God is showing me things and doing some things and working on some things. You need to grasp that doesn't change his plan. That's the world shutting down what God is going to do. God knew this would happen. And we're going to keep focusing on this reality. And today, we're going to move to the next kingdom center. And the next kingdom center was at Corinth. And go ahead and move on the next thing. And I want you to see, there should be an arrow. See, from Ephesus to Corinth. All right? That's the next kingdom center. Again, a lot of congregations along the way. But Jerusalem just was a special place because that's God's city. Antioch was a significant place because it established the concept of one new man. God actually wants to save non-Jews, which couldn't have happened from Jerusalem, but it happened in Antioch. And we saw the fivefold ministry beginning to activate, with an apostle sent for a teacher or sent for prophets. They sent everybody out to Ephesus because that was the occult capital of the Roman Empire. And that's important because it's a part of what happened in the Bible. And you have to understand that there's always a focus of each kingdom center. For example, what God birthed from this kingdom center in this neighborhood couldn't have happened anywhere else. And what's the distinction of Corinth? And this is really, really important. I've talked to a lot of leaders about this. If you want to understand how to run a service, read 2 Corinthians, if you want to understand how this works. But why it's significant to us, because Corinth in particular dealt with a breakthrough to reach the hardcore unsaved. Remember, in Antioch, they were going for Hellenists. Hellenists were Greeks that were coming to synagogue anyway. Corinth, however, is the hardcore unsaved. And that's significant because that's where the United States is. That's where we are. We're the hardcore unsaved, just like Corinth. And we will be visiting Corinth several times in my upcoming message about how things worked when you're trying to reach the hardcore unsaved. And to see what it means to reach the hardcore unsaved, there's no better place than to look at it, the kingdom center that God planted in Corinth. Go ahead and give the next. You see Athens? You've all heard of Athens because it's a famous city, right? You see how close Corinth is to Athens? All right. Corinth was one of the most important cities in the ancient world. All right? It's not as well known as Athens because they haven't made many movies about it. However, I better set my clock. It was founded in the 10th century BCE. That's when that particular city was planted. And it's just part of the thing. It was the richest city, the richest. Of course, it's a port city, like most of these major cities were. But in ancient Greece, it was the richest city. Historically, to understand these things, it was partially destroyed by Julius Caesar. It's a Greek city. The Roman Empire swept through, destroyed this city. The year was 44 BCE. BCE is before the Common Era. And it was established as a place to settle freed slaves from Italy, Syria, Egypt, Greece and Judea. You had all these slaves under the Greek system. You freed them. You need to stick them somewhere. Make a city, stick them there. Kind of like Australia was a penal colony. Corinth was a place for freed slaves. And the city just thrived. There's historical reasons which we're going to get into, but I want you to see there's always a reason God plants a kingdom center in a specific place. When Paul arrived in Corinth, he arrived around the year 51 CE, Common Era. At that point, the city of Corinth was about 100 years old. However, it was already 5 times as large as Athens and was the capital of that province. But its true significance came from the point that it was a crossroads city. See, what you see on the map is that's all Greece, but it's divided. Right? It's divided into 2 parts. You have northern Greece, where Athens is, southern Greece, where Corinth is. It's all Greece. Okay, you see it? It's divided right there. There's water. It's connected by an isthmus. There's a land bridge right there. And that little strip of land is an isthmus, if you know what that means. It's about 4 miles long. About 4 miles wide, I should say. Go ahead and put up the next line, because I think right there, that section right there is about 4 miles. And so if you were trading in Greece between North and South Greece, if you're going overland, you crossed over that isthmus. All right? It had to go through Corinth. Go to the next slide. And see, if you're going into that area, now see, you notice it doesn't go anywhere near Athens. Athens is not right there by the isthmus. That's why Corinth was so much bigger. All right? You with me? Now, if you were trading by water, in other words, you were not going overland, but you were going to use a ship. If you were going from east to west or west to east across the northern Mediterranean, because that's the northern Mediterranean Sea, all right? That's the northern edge of the Mediterranean Sea. You had a problem. Go to the next slide. There's where you're looking at. See, you're in the northern sea, and you see I don't have my pointer with me. You see where it is over there on the right side? In the area of Macedonia? Okay, that's where we are on our map. But see, if you're going to, I'm looking, anyone have a pointer? I could use my laser sight and my gun, but that might make you it might make some of you nervous. Don't look good on land, right there. But see, if you're in Italy, Spain, Northern Africa, you're going to come down and you got a problem. If you want to go to Asia, anything from that part of the world to Asia, and you're taking a ship, because remember, ships hug the coast. You didn't have your GPS. And so what do? You go and you swing around Greece. All right? Put up an arrow. I think we have an arrow next. See, to go from Asia across or Italy across, that Greece sticks out about 300 miles. and you couldn't take a ship across there. And so east-west shipping or west-east shipping, either way, had to take that long, treacherous detour around the southern. Thank you, Joan. You're with me. See, they had to go all dip around and go. It was a lot longer trip, and the waters were kind of choppy. Remember boat wrecks and things like that. It's in the Bible. And that was just a problem. And so in the year 600 BCE, okay, 600 BCE, there was a Greek guy named Periander. He said, all this, instead of making ships go all the way around, we could build a road across the isthmus. And he built a marble tramway. He laid a marble road with a pulley system above it. And what would happen is you take your ship to that isthmus, they'd hook it to a rope, put wheels underneath it, and drag it across to the other side and drop it in the water, which saved you from going all the way around. Okay? And they use oxen to get it across there. All right? That cut 200 miles off the journey. Go to the next screen. And see, instead of going around, you're kind of going across. But you're going to have oxen pulling you like, come on, we can get this ship all the way across. They weren't huge ships at that point in time. However, being good business people, it wasn't free to move your ship from one side to the other. And once he built that and he started paying to have their ships drug across, Corinth eliminated all taxes. No need to collect taxes. We're making enough money off the shippers. And so Corinth then ended up with 2 seaports. Next screen. You had that little seaport on the east side, a seaport on the west. That's where, the ships go in there, they dock, and they wait to get dragged across. And so these 2 ends became major seaports. They're by Corinth. It's the only city. See, Athens is way over there. And so you have one on the eastern side, and you can see Corinth was truly a crossroads city. You go by land, you go over to the Isthmus to Corinth. If you go by ship, you go to the seaport on either side of Corinth and pay to have your ship moved across. Talk about a crossroads city. Okay? Go to the next screen. So, if you're going north to south, south to north, you go through Corinth. If you're going east to west, west to east, you go through Corinth. Go ahead and go to the next screen. See, you got, no matter how you traveled. If you're in water, you went through Corinth. If you're on land, you go through Corinth. Now, as a result of this, that's why Corinth became one of the wealthiest cities in the world. And it was a place of worldwide influence because of everything that went through there. And it's such a significant impact on people's understanding, as you could still see it today if you know what you're looking for, because one of the things that they did in their architecture was to create the Corinthian column. And if you want to know what a Corinthian column looks like, look at the United States Embassy, look at the White House, look at the Capitol building in this country, and those pillars are all Corinthian pillars. Our whole government is built and designed, received from the ancient city of Corinth. That's how significant that city was. Okay? Now, that's the financial, political reality. However, the spiritual reason, there's a spiritual reason for the kingdom center as well in Corinth. Because they were wealthy and they could build temples to their gods. Big temples to their gods. And that is the temple to Apollo. That's the ruins of it. Octavia, the next one, that's the temple to Octavia. On the outskirts of the city was a huge temple to the god Poseidon, and that's significant for shippers, of course. That's the ruins. But the most significant temple was the massive temple to Aphrodite, which was perched on a hill above the city. Now, in this particular temple, this was the most significant temple to the whole city of Corinth. And it played a huge part in the city's reputation. They had 1,000 sacred prostitutes that operated from this temple. And the reputation of the city was total licentiousness. It was so licentious that it impacted the Greek language of the world. The Greek word that you will translate fornication in the Bible is Corinthiazomai, which means you act like a Corinthian. When it says God doesn't like fornication, it's saying God doesn't like you to act like a Corinthian. That's how bad that city was. Throughout the Roman Empire, if you called somebody a Corinthian girl, that means she was a prostitute. They didn't say that's a prostitute. They said that's a Corinthian girl. Anywhere in the empire. If anyone came down with Corinthian sickness, what does that mean? They had a venereal disease. And you have to see the significance of this style of worship. Immortality was an accepted and celebrated part of the culture. That's how they worshiped. It was absolutely acceptable. In the temples of Corinth, all of them, they had rampant orgies and visits to prostitutes. And that was all considered to be worship. You want to worship your God? Go to a temple and have an orgy. That's worship. So Corinth was not just a pagan city. It was a place of depravity and debauchery. And as I said earlier, it was a center for these people are the hardcore lost. You know, in Antioch, there were Greeks going to the temple because they had an interest. In Corinth, no one going to a Jewish place to find out about their God. Their gods were quite a bit different. These are the hardcore lost. So you had a wealthy, immoral gathering place, which was the center of world trade. And that's why God chose to institute a kingdom center there. This isn't just the occult. This is really the hardcore lost. And to see how God planted that kingdom center. Kingdom centers don't just happen. Paul didn't leave from Ephesus and say, I think I'll go to Corinth and plant a kingdom center. You read the book of Acts, that's not what happened. Because remember, he was in Antioch, and the prophets came up from Jerusalem, and they sent he and Silas out, right? And when Paul arrived, he went across Asia Minor. He had to go across Asia Minor, is what it was called then. And when I'm just walking through the book of Acts, if you've ever read it, he got to Troas, and in Troas, God spoke to him a dream. Remember the book of Acts? He was in the city of Troas, and God spoke to him in a dream. Go to the next screen. I think it's a map. Troas is right up there above Ephesus. See, you go straight north. You see Troas on the map? I'm in Acts 16. I'm moving through the book of Acts. This is chapter 16, verse 6 through 10, if you're taking notes. So they being Paul and Timothy, because Timothy was his protege traveling with him, went through the regions of Phrygia and Galatia. They're going north. Having been forbidden by the Ruach HaKodesh to speak the word in Asia. In other words, when they were moving from Ephesus up towards Troas, God said, don't give the message on the way. He forbade them from giving the message out. They just kept going north. They didn't stop anywhere until they got to Troas. In verse 7, when they came to Mysia, they were trying to proceed into I love Greek, Bithynia, but the Ruach of Yeshua would not allow them. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. So they're moving, God's not letting them do anything, and God sends them over to Troas. Now, in a vision appeared to Paul in verse 9, in the night, a man from Macedonia was standing and pleading with him, come over to Macedonia. That's verse 9. Come over to Macedonia, which isn't on that particular map, but they're going that way, right there. That map doesn't say it, but that's where it is. Thank you, Joan. I didn't know I had that. And as soon as they had seen the vision, immediately they tried to go Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to proclaim good news to them. And so we're going to track the journey. Okay, now I know where I am in my overhead. They put out to sea at, just hold on, Joan, don't move anywhere. They went from sea, that's chapter 16, verse 11, and made course for Samothrace. From there to Samothrace, okay? Continuing reading in the Bible. The next day they went to Neapolis. Go ahead, Joan. See it up there? And from there, verse 12, they went to Philippi. Go ahead, Joan. Right there, see? Just the book of Acts. Which was the leading city in the district of Macedonia as well as a Roman colony. We stayed in that city for several days, Paul writes. All right? Now, the reason I read all that, because this is a momentous journey. Because when you move from Troas to Macedonia, I don't know where I'm trying to figure out where the overheads are going. Paul crossed the dividing line between Asia and Europe. Put the next, there must be an arrow. Is there an arrow next? Yeah. When you go from there to there, you've moved from Asia to Europe, and for the first time, the gospel is being preached in Europe. It's significant because that's just a reality. And the first time the gospel was presented in Europe, it was in Philippi, hence the letter to Philippians, all right? Not a kingdom center, but he planted a congregation. As a matter of fact, he planted several congregations as he kept moving. Next screen. He set them. You can't see it, but it's Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. Okay, Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. And it took him 3 weeks to plant those 3 congregations. 3 weeks to plant those 3 congregations. How do you plant a congregation that quickly? It's really simple. He starts in a synagogue, a Jewish synagogue. And from that Jewish synagogue, he takes a group out and he plants them in a congregation. So what do you have? You have people that already know the Bible. They already know the one true God. They knew how to run a Shabbat service. Sunday services wouldn't happen for a long time. And because they ran Shabbat services, they did Erev Shabbat with their own families every Friday evening. All they needed to do was meet Messiah Yeshua, and they're ready to go. So you have a group of trained leaders. They start a congregation, and he moves, gets some Jews saved, plant a congregation. They know how to They know how to run a service. They know how to keep the Shabbat. They knew the Bible as it existed at that point in time. And they could present the good news to everybody because all they needed to do was meet the Messiah Yeshua. And the rest of it comes together. So if you have Jewish leadership, you can plant a congregation. All right? And Paul moved up through Greece and down through that area of Europe and got to Corinth, straight down. See? Straight down. Which means he went down and crossed the land bridge, right? I'm just reading the Bible. He plants congregation, but then he goes down to Corinth. Now, in Corinth, he's not going to just plant a congregation. Once again, God is going to plant a kingdom center. A kingdom center is not a congregation. Kingdom centers support the congregations. Totally legitimate to have a congregation. But God had to plant this congregation to establish a foothold in Europe. Everything else had been done over in Greece and Asia. This was the first kingdom center in Europe. And that moves us to Acts chapter 18, beginning in verse 1. And I'm going to read from verse 1 to 11 if you're taking notes. After these things, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. This isn't rocket science. This is just following the Bible. And he found a Jewish man named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because, all important in verse 2, Claudius had commanded all the Jewish people to leave Rome. Paul went to see them. Now, that's significant because that's an historical reference. This is after the emperor threw all the Jews out of Rome. And he met Jewish believers who had come from Rome and settled in Corinth because Caesar had kicked them out of Rome. That's important because that's tied to the letter to Romans. All right? Verse 3, because he was of the same trade, which is tent maker, he stayed with them and began working by trade. It says they were tent makers. Verse 4, and he was debating every Shabbat in the synagogue, trying to persuade both Jewish and Greek people. In other words, in the Jewish temples, synagogues, they weren't called temples then, they were synagogue. Greek word, synagogue. They were a Jewish congregation. There was always Hellenists. There's always Greeks that are interested in finding about that God. There's always Gentiles in a biblical congregation, even if it's not Messianic. Verse 5. Verse 5. Now when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, remember Paul and Silas were going out, but Timothy is a key player because he's a protege of Paul, so he's mentioned. Paul became occupied with a message urgently testifying to the Jewish people that Yeshua is Messiah. Okay? Paul still got that focus, the Jewish people, the Jewish people, the Jewish people. Verse 6, but they resisted and reviled him. He shook out his garments, saying, your blood be upon your own hands, I am clean. From now on, I go to the Gentiles. It's like, I'm getting frustrated with you people. I'm going to go ahead and just go to Gentiles. No longer Greeks, because he's no longer in Greece. He's in Europe. Okay? Verse 7, after leaving there, Paul went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a God-fearer whose house was next door to the synagogue. Going to plant a kingdom center, you might as well do it next door to the synagogue, which is a Jewish synagogue. You have to say Jewish synagogue because everything's called a synagogue at that point in history. Crispus, the synagogue leader, put his faith in the Lord along with the whole household. Many of the Corinthians, upon hearing them, were believing, being immersed. So the house next door used to belong to the ruler of the synagogue. Now he uses his house next door to plant a kingdom center. And then many were believing and being immersed. Verse 9. Now the Lord said to Paul through a vision of night, do not be afraid, but speak, and do not be silent. Verse 10, for I am with you, no one shall attack or harm you. Many people in this city are for me. So verse 11, he stayed 1 year and 6 months there teaching the word of God among them. Not planting a congregation a week. He's planting a kingdom center. He's going to spend 1 year and 6 months there. Because this is not just another congregation. This is a kingdom center. So just to keep it fresh in your mind, where did we begin? The Garden of Eden. Then where did we go? Next kingdom center? The ark. After the flood. We moved to Abraham, the land of Israel, and the all-important kingdom center of Jerusalem. Because that's the center of God's kingdom is Jerusalem. But Ephesus was the next one because we had to get one new man. Gentiles had to start coming into the kingdom. And remember, Ephesus was the center of occult activity in the Roman Empire. That's part of the history you need to know because it impacts what's going to happen in the future. Then Paul jumps to Europe and plants a kingdom center in Corinth. Corinth was Vegas of its day. Okay? It was a hub of sin and depravity. Therefore, it was a strategic place to reveal God's plan and transform the heart of the unsaved. In each region, kingdom centers were established where they would have the greatest influence on that territory. That's why God called us here for this neighborhood. Paul, though, knowing that God wanted to reach the Roman Empire, what city does he really need to get to? Rome. right? He knew it's only logical that God wants something in Rome. It's not the city that is known for its occult activity. It's not the city who is known for its immorality. It's not the city, it's the city that is the capital of the world. All right? And he has this great desire to get to Rome. There's a problem in Rome. What's the problem in Rome? Caesar had thrown out all the Jews. In other words, this is not something, if you want to, this is my opinion, all the leadership was Jewish to this point in the congregation. Now, since we were in Antioch, it was a mixed congregation, but the leadership was always Jewish. It's just because I believe that was God's plan all along. When all the Jews were thrown out by Caesar, you had a congregation for the first time that had Gentile leadership. And they went a little bit Meshuggah. And what happened was that Caesar died. I'm getting way ahead of myself, but Jews were allowed to go back home to Rome. And they showed up in Rome and said, "We're back, we're Jewish." And they said, "You're not Jewish, we're Jewish." It's like, no, God chose us. And he said, yeah. They said, yeah, but he's done choosing you. He now chose us, and we are now Israel. That's where that particular story happened. It wasn't anything other than the way. And it happened, we ended up with non-Jewish leadership. The people said, obviously God is done with the Jews. We're now Israel. And so the Jewish people came back and said, we're Israel. And they were saying, no, you're not Israel, we're Israel. And there was this battle going on within the congregation. It's like, what am I, chopped liver? I'm Israel. And they said, we're Israel. I said, you can't be Israel, we're Israel. Paul writes a letter to them because he hears about the confusion in the congregation. Okay? Let me see where I am. You have to understand, when you read the first letter of Corinthians, it's like, quit behaving like Corinthians, right? You're getting drunk, you're sleeping with, you're having sex where you shouldn't have sex. That's not the way it's supposed to be. And people who don't know the history think he's writing to a backslidden church. They backslid. No, that's just the way they were. I'm part of the Jesus movement. I was swept into the kingdom during the Jesus movement. A rock band got saved during the Jesus movement, and they went out and got high to celebrate their salvation because they didn't know they weren't supposed to. I won't mention their name. See, Corinthians got saved, and how do you worship? Let's have an orgy. And he's saying, no, you don't behave like Corinthians anymore. When you read 2 Corinthians, it's like, well, they got better. They did. They quit acting like Corinthians. They said, okay, now do everything decently and in order. Don't behave like a Corinthian. If you read the two letters, that's what you're dealing with. And so in Rome, you got this congregation where the Gentiles are saying, we're Israel. And the Jews saying, no, you're not. We're Israel. And there's this battle going on. The English word for that is replacement theology. Started in Rome, in biblical Rome, not in the Catholic Church, in biblical Rome. Don't blame the Catholic Church for everything, okay? And so Paul writes a letter to this congregation that's just being a little bit Meshuggah. They're not hardcore lost like they were in Corinth. But, getting drunk, sleeping with the wrong people. No. You're behaving. You can't. Now, they weren't in Corinth, understand. It was just, you can't do those things. But when you get up to Rome, that's not the issue. The issue is who's Israel? The Gentiles or the Jews? All right? Just accept that. So in Romans chapter 1 down to verse 7, to all those in Rome, he writes, loved by God, called to be kedoshim, separated ones. Grace to you and shalom from God our Father and the Lord Yeshua the Messiah. Verse 8, first I thank my God through Messiah Yeshua for all of you because your faithfulness is made known throughout the whole world. He's being very nice to them. Verse 9, for God is my witness whom I serve with my spirit the good news of his Son, how unceasingly I make mention of you. Verse 10, always pleading in my prayers, if somehow by God's will now at last I will be granted a good journey to come to you. He wrote the letter to Romans before he has ever visited Rome, but in his heart he knew he had to get to Rome. He knew he had to get to Rome. Talk about a strategic kingdom center, right, for the Roman Empire. It's the governmental hub. It's the center of the civilized world. So if you're going to really reach the world, you got to impact Rome. Right? All roads lead to Rome, which means all roads lead out of Rome. So in order to reach the world, everybody knows you got to reach Rome. Because Rome was the absolutely most important city in the ancient world. It was the capital of the whole civilized world. And there's no accurate story to how was that Roman congregation planted. Who planted the congregation in Rome? It ended up with no Jewish leadership because there was a point in history where God threw out the Jewish people, including Jewish believers, right? And they met Paul, and they'd been thrown out of Rome. I mentioned that's significant because that's what happened to Rome. The Jewish leadership left. Where did it happen? In my opinion, it happened at Shavuot in the 2nd chapter of Acts. And I'm just going to read straight through there. When the day of Shavuot, Gentiles call that Pentecost. Pentecost means 50. Shavuot means weeks. It's just a different title. It's not a plot. They're all together in one place because you're supposed to gather. Suddenly, this is back in Jerusalem, by the way, of course. Suddenly there came from heaven a sound of a mighty rushing wind. The whole building was filled where they were sitting, and tongues of fire spreading out appeared to them and settled on each one of them. What does that remind you of? Sinai, the revelation of God. Same terminology used. It's Sinai when we received the revelation of God of the Torah. They are all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with tongues as the Ruach enabled them to speak out. Verse 5, now Jewish people were staying in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven. It's a pilgrimage festival. Jews from all the world came to Jerusalem for this festival. Verse 6, when the sound came, the crowd gathered, and they were bewildered because each one heard them speaking their own language, and they were amazed and astonished, saying, aren't all those speaking, these people, aren't they Galileans? Nobody liked Galileans. Remember, can anything good come out of Galilee? Because it was called Galilee of the Nations, because of the Via Maris. How is it that we each hear them in our own birth language? But here's the key, verse 9. Who was there? Jews from Parthians, Medes, Elamites, those living in Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Gala. Verse 10, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, parts of Libya and Cyrene, and visitors from Rome. That's where this Roman, in my opinion, that's how they had a congregation in Rome. They had Jewish people who received the Messiah at the 2nd chapter of Acts, went home to Rome and planted a congregation. All right? And remember, then Caesar came up, who didn't know Joseph type kind of thing, threw the the Jews out. Now they lose all the Jewish leadership members of that congregation. And for the first time in history, you have an all-Gentile congregation, which led to a whole lot of confusion. And Paul writes the letter to Romans to help them with their confused theology. These aren't people that are lost. These are Gentiles who have no Jewish leadership. And they've gone off a little bit Meshuggah. They have their salvation. They are a Messiah-centered congregation. All right? Nothing strange happened. There was no Easter Bunny or Santa Claus. For a long time past this, they were biblically oriented Gentiles. They were still following the way. All right? Is there another screen that shows Rome, by the way? Yeah, there it is. See where Rome is? Okay. And I'm not going to teach a lot about this congregation because you don't know much about it except historically. You know that there was a congregation there. You know the Jews got thrown out. They went crazy, which, as Paul said, is God thrown out the Jews? God forbid, I'm Jewish. Right? Romans 9, 10, 11. You know, wait a minute. God hasn't cast out the Jews. God forbid. I'm Jewish. He was just trying to help them out. Wasn't a rebuke. They were just confused. And so, as far as kingdom centers go, you know absolutely nothing biblically about what happened in Rome. The Bible ends in Rome. I might get into this a little bit more because I'm going to end with these final thoughts. God wanted Paul to get to Rome. But he didn't want him to go to Rome. He wanted him to go to Rome under arrest. In order to impact Rome, he had to have him under arrest. And he had to appeal to Caesar. And there's a reason for that we'll cover next week. Because it's critical to understand the rest of the city, the rest of the story. Is there another screen or not? Yeah, because from Rome, the gospel was going to push north. Out of Italy, that's where Rome is, right? Into all of Europe, specifically England, what we call England, Ireland, and Scotland. And that's where we're going to go. Okay? That's where we're going to go in this series, because we're leaving the Bible, but I will give you historical things that are true. Feel free to check any of these things. I'm telling you, I'm not sloppy. And what I want to do is back up, retrace our steps, and see what happened. And I want to do that for a specific reason. I want you to really grasp. I taught this about a year ago. But you weren't in a kingdom center. But you learned about it. I want you to see what happened. What happened that we got to where we are today, which is not like anything in the book of Acts. It's nothing like the book of Acts. Paul would be confused if he walked into this congregation, saw a guy up front with a microphone, and everybody sitting there watching. That's confusing. That's not the way, or read 2 Corinthians. Does it say get a pastor to stand in front of the congregation, elevated, looking down at you? What happened? Okay. That's where we're going to go with this. Hopefully, pray that I can keep it really simple for you. Thank you, Joan, for all your hard work. I appreciate all of you showing up. And as long as anyone shows up, and let me explain something to you. I have commitment from the stage in the back, which runs everything. And by the way, if you're watching online, we have discovered there's a problem with sound that is not from us. But we have discovered it. The computer can't pick up the range of sound in our praise and worship. And online, you don't get the quality you get in this sanctuary. We're going to try to fix that. It's a limitation of computers. It's not a bad mix. There's a limitation of the range that we play in music in particular. We're going to be dealing with all that reality. Don't forget, Seder starts, where's Serena? Wednesday? Wednesday at 7 p.m., right? Wednesday at 7 p.m.? That's good because I have to go out to a couple places on Tuesday. If you want to come to this Seder, make sure you sign up so we know how many people come. If you want to do your own Seder, we will webcast it live. Get one of my Haggadot to follow along. It's a booklet. You can buy one here. You can buy one, get me off my house, or go to Amazon again. Look for Messianic Haggadah, Haggdah, by Judah Hungerman. All right? Amazon sells them. They're actually cheaper. They're $9.95. I sell them for $10. You could save a nickel if you buy them off of Amazon. Do you want to say something? Or are you just standing? If you're going to, I already told him that.